Hi, everyone. If you're watching this, welcome to Tsai City. If you're brand new, if you're returning to Tsai City, welcome back, even though you're watching this at a different time than we were presenting this. So don't have too much to share, but just introducing Professor Andrew Heinrich, who's a stellar professor here at the School of Public Health here at Yale. And he's going to talk about the regulation for entrepreneurs for med devices and drug companies. So with that, the floor is all yours, Andrew.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Really great to be here and to speak to all of the Tsai City students and entrepreneurs who are thinking about the way that regulation interacts with them. Obviously, drugs, devices, food, those are areas of specialization for me, but I think that they're comparable lessons for so many in Tsai City. So what we'll do today is first we'll ask ourselves why entrepreneurs need to concern themselves with regulation and when in the process. And then I will walk through the process in 3 stages. I'll talk about the research and development phase, the approval process, and of course, the mergers and acquisitions process ultimately. And then if time allows, I will get to a brief comment on technology forcing regulation. So I think a great exercise for those who are doing this asynchronously before you keep going is to ask yourself why entrepreneurs need to concern themselves with regulation and when in the process, and to maybe pause the video and take a couple seconds to think about where they think they'll interact with that regulation. Once they've done that, once you've done that, I encourage you to go to the next slide, and you'll see basically for everything all the time is my answer. And I have a few biotech examples I want to give where it shows that regulation really sets the groundwork for research and design and even what's possible at all. So one example, which is great here, I think is illustrative of the early stages of R&D and how regulation fits in, is the very basic facts of how research funding is allocated. Is a highly regulated space, particularly government regulation, and so government funding. So I think that being aware of that is itself important. But my favorite example, and we'll get back to this later, is the what is a food and what is a drug distinction. So a nutritional supplement is a food. And some people say that's not regulated by the FDA. That's like very much like when people say that they're afebrile, that they don't have a fever, that they have no temperature. Everything that's food is regulated by the FDA, just doesn't have to go through the same sort of approval process that a drug does. And so where nutritional supplements or weight loss supplements fall on that spectrum of food to drug might actually dictate what you research and design in the very first place. Because you might not have the budget, or you might not have the capacity, or you might not have the interest, or any other combination of reasons to go through a drug approval process for what you want to design, but you're happy for it to go through a food inspection process. And so what that could mean is it could alter the very thing you seek to design, knowing what the regulatory implications will be down the road. And again, I'll get back to that example a little bit later. Another example of this is supersonic flight. To just leave the biotech space for a moment to just give a really nice example. There are regulations about sound pollution. And so sound pollution, which is something that's created by the sonic boom of a supersonic flight, has dictated the spaces in which supersonic flight is being innovated. One area is the goal of innovating supersonic flight so that it works perfectly over water, so that this sound pollution issue is not an issue. The other is simply seeking to reduce the sound pollution so that it can fly over land. And so what you see is that the regulatory atmosphere around sound pollution has actually bifurcated the supersonic flight industry. Of course, once you get to market, it's obvious that it matters. It regulates what's sold and how it can be sold. I think what's less discussed is that it continues to regulate a product once it's brought to market. There's no such thing that the government stops regulating at a certain point and the market forces take over. Regulation is being done by different types of people. There are a lot of private organizations getting involved in regulation. In fact, industry standards are often much higher than, say, FDA standards, or can be much higher than FDA standards in certain areas. So it's really important to remember that it's not just government doing the regulating. And therefore, my final point is regulation is itself an area for entrepreneurship. In fact, one of Yale College's own, David Light, who's the founder of a phenomenal organization called Valisher, that's in Science Park just down the road, works on this very issue. He is a quality assurance and testing lab for generic drugs, and has had phenomenal findings, well, scary findings if you take generic drugs, but phenomenal findings for our safety, and is a great reminder of how generics are, how regulation is itself a place where you can be an entrepreneur. So let's talk a little bit about regulation in the R&D process. So like I said already, it sets the realm of what's possible. This is a clear area of supplements, by which I mean nutritional supplements like protein powders, diet pills, etc. This has been the Wild West of FDA regulation for a while, until there were goals to crack down, particularly on some of the diet pills. And what ended up happening is that the labs that were doing the design of these these modalities of these pills altered their formula over time to continue to avoid drug regulation. And so, or drug approval process, I should say, and continued post-market regulation as a drug. So, you need to know how regulation considers your product. Are you going to be a food or a drug? That's the obvious one. Now, you can also look ahead to the approval process. This is where coded stents come in. So the FDA says that a stent is a device. If you coat the stent in a drug that, say, is on the surface of the stent and interacts with is absorbed by the vessels in the tissue of the where the surgeon puts in the stent. Once the stent is inserted, and is that functioning as a drug as well? And so does this device have both a device component and a drug component? Is it a device drug, which is a whole category altogether? The FDA doesn't have such a category yet. There is a sort of device with drug element category though. So that's part of the device approval process. But you could see both of these products going through separate regulatory spaces. And then what the FDA said is that the drug needs to be approved, the device needs to be approved, and then their use together needs to be approved. And so it's kind of three processes in one, depending on what you're using. And then, of course, the way that seed funding is done and additional fundraising and venture capital and all that, that's highly regulated, not by the FDA as much as it is by other industries like the other agencies like the SEC. But that's a whole area of regulation all unto itself. Now, the approval process is where everything is where most of this attention is paid, for the most part. The first question, though, and I think most people would start with what's on question number 2 on this slide, but I encourage you to think about question number 1. Where are you going to seek approval? And the obvious answer might sound, well, gee, where I want to sell my product. But that's not the only answer. In fact, one of the things that's happening a lot in Europe is that there are a lot of pharmaceuticals that are seeking the approval in the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, solely so that they can do trials in Eastern Europe. And the reason for this is that there are not a lot of trials patients to go around. The availability of a trials patient or enough trials patients to run a trial that is statistically significant is a significant contributing factor to the decision of where to seek your drug's approval. Now, of course, so is marketing and other things of that nature, how pricing will be affected by where you seek approval. So it has to be a more comprehensive thought process than just, gee, I'm an American, I'm designing something in America, I know some Americans are going to buy it. Well, that will mean you're going to seek FDA approval at some point. But sometimes if you get approval somewhere else first and you start to sell it, it's easier to get approval in the US, or maybe you don't want to do that for any number of reasons. So even the just where will you seek approval is an important strategic point. Now, the next 3 points on this slide, points 2 through 4, are made exclusively with respect to the FDA in the United States, but they have analogous structures in every jurisdiction you would be interested in. The first thing you do is you submit an application. In the FDA's case, it's called an IND. It is extraordinary, and I cannot emphasize this enough, how important it is to have a regulatory expert with you on this stage. It is extraordinary how many very, very, very bad INDs are submitted to the FDA, and by which I mean like atrociously bad. Basic mistakes are made, directions are not followed. All of the things that would get you in trouble with your professor on an exam here are done on INDs in spades, and it's embarrassing. So find someone who actually knows how to fill these out. and how to put the proper attachments on, and how to direct you to provide the right information in the right format. Then, of course, there's the trials, there's the clinical trials. This is where, again, everyone's focus is really on these 3 trials. And of course, they're important, but you have to get to this stage, and then you have to get through the stage. The other thing I'll mention is the 3 trials are so expensive and so arduous that typically this is where a lot of investment and equity events happen. That, you know, you kind of get to the phase 3 stage, which is just an efficacy test. It's starting to look efficacious, and that's when a sale happens. Because everything before this is so expensive and the runway is so long to get to that phase. Number 4 is post-market regulation. This is a growing area of regulation. Some people often ask me, you know, gee, if we do our jobs right in the 3 phases, do we even need post-market regulation? And the answer is yes, because there's so many comorbidities you couldn't test because you had a limited controlled population. You have so many unforeseen consequences because the medicine no longer is or drug or device or food or whatever is no longer administered in a vacuum. So there might be interaction effects with other chemicals that you didn't foresee. And there could be problems in the supply chain, which are unrelated to how the product was developed in the lab. And so, you know, this is a growing area of regulation, and this is where recalls, corrections, and removals are carried out. And these are the tools that are used when there's a problem once a product is brought to market. And then you have regulation in the M&A process. And I put 3 categories. They're kind of overlapping in different ways. But obviously, investment banks have tons of regulations, you know, Dodd-Frank and other things to consider. But also, I quote an investment banker who said to me, who's a healthcare investment banker, who says, regulatory risk is key to our risk assessment. And he said, look, the main thing we look at when we look at making an investment in the healthcare space is simply, will this thing get FDA approval? And that's the sole thing. If the answer is yes, it will, we'll invest a lot of money. If the answer is we're not so sure, we won't invest at all. Venture capital actually is the opposite, where they say we want to gamble because we hope the appreciation of the company is there, but they're trying to predict the FDA process. In fact, one thing that a lot of regulatory scientists and professors get is requests from venture capital to come on as a consultant for 1 month because they're thinking of making a certain acquisition or addition to their portfolio, and they want you to try and project if the thing is going to get FDA approval, whatever thing they're looking at investing in. Ditto for potential acquisitions. Like I said, that phase 3, right at the cusp of approval stage, and then right after approval stage, this is a huge part of where acquisitions happen. So what a lot of, especially drugs, go through is development, like folks like you who are listening to this. Then you kind of get acquired, or you partner up with someone who can push you through the trial phases. And then the Pfizer, Merck, big pharma of the world buy you out right when you're hitting the market. And so that's the typical life cycle of a development of a new product. And the only reason that cycle exists is the regulatory process. If our regulatory framework were set up differently, it would not happen in the way I've just described. So time allows, so I get to talk about tech forcing regulation. Technology forcing regulation is about a 30-year-old concept now. Well, I guess more like 40-year-old, I'm old, 40-year-old concept that says basically that regulation can force the development of new technologies. Now, some people don't like this. Others say it's possible but undesirable. But the idea of it for your own views to be formed is the following. Say that we said, we now are, for example, the Food and Drug Administration, and we say that by 2040, there will be no opportunity to advertise prescription drugs on television, let's say. And they get together with the FCC and everyone agrees on this. Well, the way that advertising would change about those products would be massive. And you could force better practices in the industry just by doing that. I'll give an example outside of this. Fuel efficiency. Imagine if there was a regulation that said by 2040, all cars on the road in the United States must get 250 miles to the gallon. I'm making up a number that would probably get struck down in court as arbitrary and capricious. That's a term from the Administrative Procedures Act. But the point stands. I assure you that all of the innovation that's being put into how nice the stereo sounds in your car, from the time that an investment that Mercedes is putting into that and their counterparts, they would put it immediately into fuel efficiency if something held up in court that really required them to get there by 2040. So technology forcing regulations say, look, let's set a goalpost, a regulatory goalpost out in the future and force people to get there. Now, like I said, what your goalpost is can't be random. There's a term called arbitrary and capricious. You can't just make it up. So you can't say, for example, that there can be no silicon in anything. This is a famous court case because yes, silicosis carries some risk of cancer, but so does a lot of stuff. So does your microwave, most likely. And it might just be an infinitesimally small near zero risk in the case of your microwave. So we don't ban microwaves because there's a non-zero risk. There's a non-zero risk I get cancer when I walk outside because of sun exposure. That doesn't mean we're going to require everyone to wear sunglasses and a full brimmed hat over their head and whatever. So your force, the degree of innovation that you force through technology, through regulation, must be based in science, but it is possible. And in fact, we probably see this all the time because just like I mentioned, those nutritional supplements, they're increasing requirements around what it means to be organic, for example. And that is changing farming practices. It's more to do with USDA than FDA, but they interact on the topic. The point is that regulation is an active tool. It's not just a recipient of everyone's inventions. And what I think tech forcing regulation brings home that really frames the whole presentation is that regulation creates the framework in which innovators work. And so those of you who are designing a new product, the regulatory landscape is one of your a priori first steps, is to say what is going on here in the regulatory space. You take it as fact and then you move forward. So with that, I thank you for your time and for listening. I'm more than happy to receive questions or comments. I can type my email into the chat that hopefully makes its way into the recording. And thank you for your time and your attention and your interest in designing new innovative tools in places that are really important to me. So thank you.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, this is great. I know I learned a lot in this, so thanks for doing this, especially asynchronously. Maybe one question for you I have at least.
Please.
You mentioned that, hey, find a person that's gone through FDA and has done these applications, right? Like, how do you go find that person? Like, where are they? And two, how do you know, this person doesn't, they actually know what they're talking about, not just like, hey, I have this, fancy looking resume.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are a lot of regulatory affairs private consultants, and obviously I don't see my job as recommending or not recommending in particular regulatory affairs consultant. So make your own judgments. But my general point would be, I think that you have more than enough expertise within the university. So there is YCCI, which works on clinical trials. They are Yale Cancer Center. Obviously, the regulatory affairs and regulatory sciences programs at Yale School of Public Health. So you have plenty of folks who have gone through INDs before with some regularity, or have at least reviewed INDs before with some regularity at the school and at the university more generally. So I would encourage you to start there, and then depending on your particular product under development, I'm sure that you can be referred to someone who's more specialized.
Perfect. And then actually one more question for you is you kind of touched on it, right? The timing of like when to actually look at regulations and things like that. But I think a common thing that at least I see here at Tsai City is, okay, do you focus on customer development, understanding, okay, potentially who is this person for, or do you go straight to regulations first before even doing any of that background research? Like, do you just like, if you have an idea or like, hey, this is what it might be, do you just go straight to checking the regulations? Is that kind of how you would approach it?
Yeah, so I think that those two things have to happen in tandem because, whatever you think the ideal customer experience is, or, for example, it could be that the ideal customer experience of a stent in some hypothetical is something that is both physically impossible and regulatorily impossible. And so, in fact, I suspect that would be the case, or at least impossible by current regulatory standards and current scientific knowledge. And so I think that you have to look at what exists currently. I think that, some of it, so let's say someone at Tsai City were developing self-driving vehicles, autonomous vehicles. The jury's still out on who's going to regulate what part of that and how data privacy will be thought of and so forth. So you might be in uncharted waters. But I think you really would need a solid opinion on what could happen, at least from someone who specializes in your regulatory area of interest before you proceed past that early design thinking stage.
Cool. Well, that's all I have. No, thanks for doing this asynchronous. I know I learned a lot. And then for those that are watching, yeah, feel free. We will have put Andrew's email there. And also we're here to help here at Tsai City too. Feel free to sign up for office hours or really just plug into any of our programs here at Tsai City. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording here.